guess one is maybe trying to highlight that artists activists may have also been somewhat in the vanguard or advance in terms of raising some pertinent ESG issues. So the first case, it deals with climate and ecological justice to end oil sponsorship of the arts. And this may be maybe the most well-known of the three examples. And I've really sort of drawn on the situation following BP in the Gulf of Mexico catastrophe of 2010. I mean, several UK-based organizations, Art Not Oil platform, Liberate Tate, have sought to end oil industry sponsorship in the arts. And there's been a focused attention on BP and the then sponsors, British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, and Tate, and with a particular target of Tate to drop BP as a sponsor. The second case focuses on protecting migrant worker rights and also the territorial expansion of museums. In partnership with Human Rights Watch, Gulf Labor, a coalition of artists and activists, was formed in 2010 to highlight the coercive recruitment and deplorable living and working conditions of migrant laborers in Abu Dhabi's Saadiyat Island, so-called Island of Happiness, an ambitious state-backed project to create a premier island destination, which includes a designated culture quarter with the Guggenheim Foundation and the Louvre as partner institutions. Now, the goal for Gulf Labor has been to demand that the Guggenheim Foundation obtain contractual guarantees that will protect the rights of workers employed in the construction and maintenance of its new branch museum in Abu Dhabi. And we certainly see some commonality with some of the issues raised in Qatar now regarding the World Cup and the creation of the various stadiums. And in the third case, it focuses on toxic philanthropy and removing unsuitable donors from cultural institutions. PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, was formed in 2010 or 2017 by Nan Golden, a contemporary photographer, drawing on her own opiate struggle to address the opiate overdose crisis in America by targeting both the Sackler family, who via Purdue Pharma made their fortune promoting addiction by manufacturing and pushing OxyContin, and the toxic philanthropy of museums such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Guggenheim Foundation, and universities that carry the Sackler name. So one of the goals of Nan Golding and Payne has demanded that all museums, universities, and institutions worldwide remove the Sackler signage. I mean, that is refuse Sackler funding and cut ties with the family. And I guess by way of conclusion, I was really trying to highlight that artists serving as activist stakeholders can help art museums make better decisions by challenging how to measure success. That direct action and collective collaborative responses by artist activists have been central to increasing pressure to hold art museums accountable over where their money is coming from. These public demonstrations include techniques of shock and transgression, contribute to our at least one understanding of stakeholder capitalism. I mean, first, it demonstrates ESG concerns as key risk and opportunities to help answer the question, who is beyond the pale as an acceptable art museum partner, and why? Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to criminal charges connected to marketing of the addictive painkiller OxyContin in 2020. In 2021, the Metropolitan Museum of Art dropped the Sackler name from its building, where Sackler appears in 7 spaces, deemed perhaps the museum world's most prominent cutting of ties with the disgraced family. Golden and Payne on the Met's decision. We're so happy that the Met has listened to Payne and their own moral conscience. We're grateful to the Met for leading the charge and wait for all other museums who bear the name of Sackler to follow suit. I guess it was a prominent role of Nan Golding in drawing direct links between the Sacklers, Purdue Pharma, OxyContin, the opiate crisis, and toxic philanthropy that made her campaign successful. In the case of reducing big oil and gas sponsorship, yes, I think there have been some sort of successes. Certainly in the case of Tate and BP, the relationship has ended. But as noted in a Financial Times editorial, refusing donations from, say, BP or Shell would be excessive while most consumers continue to use their products daily. So I think we do sort of see arts organizations that continue and justify their relationship with BP and Shell, even though some organizations have cut ties with big oil and gas. Thirdly, in the third case, I mean, I think there are challenges in protecting migrant rights as the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi remains under construction. As Gulf labor recognizes, the labor practices employed on Saadiyat Island reflect a more general trend in our time to put the so-called bottom line ahead of everything, including the safety and general well-being of workers and their conditions of life. Yet it is vital for Gulf labor to imagine what a better alternative form of conduct looks like. So I think it can be sort of optimistic also in terms of at least raising the issue that may not have been so visible before. Maybe there's something similar has also occurred in terms of thinking about the World Cup in Qatar. Finally, I think 2 other points. I mean, the demands of artists as activist stakeholders can also align with recent calls for a more modest museum as maybe a post-pandemic response to so-called superstar museums fueled by money and power. And certainly within the practice of institutional critique, which I haven't really been able to develop in this short talk, the case studies of the artists as activist stakeholders contribute to the transformation of audiences by drawing closer links between art and life, namely beyond the confines of the art world. So thank you very much for your time and listening to the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chung. And I would like to invite, if we run a bit over time, but there's still time for at least a question. So among the public, if you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and directly speak.
The question that I have really relates to whether any of this activism makes a difference, because the ultimate goal isn't to change the behavior of art museums, it's to change the behavior of oil companies, either directly or indirectly through public policy. So is there any evidence that this activism is anything other than performative in terms of affecting art museums?
I think it is performative. I think where it can have a role is it can remove some of the publicity or public relations that the corporations have gained from their association with arts and cultural institutions, because they'll often use the activists would argue the sponsorship as a form of greenwashing. So to make that less acceptable in terms of not wanting to associate, that can be sort of one signal of doing so, in the same way with maybe the Sackler family. And it may also provide museums, at least as one organization, that would then be providing maybe a benchmark in terms of vetting who's deemed to be an acceptable organization for partnership arrangements.
Because we are running out of time and we need time for the other speakers as well. So, yeah, I was wondering if you could go to the next, Harry Van Buren, if you could, well, if you could, thank you very much first, Mr. Chung, for your presentation. If you could stop sharing your screen and go to Mr. Harry Van Buren. His presentation is about making the invisible visible, stakeholders, capitalism, and powerless stakeholders.
Great. And Derek, if
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. So yeah.
Now to find the presentation, and here we go. Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper. I'm Harry Van Buren from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and this is a paper with my co-author, Judith Strom-Sterling from the University of Geneva. And we're focusing on the notion of invisibility in stakeholder capitalism and linking it to powerless stakeholders. I think one of the themes that has really run through a lot of the presentations, and indeed the entire workshop today and tomorrow, is thinking about the relationships among value creation, stakeholders, and business ethics. So trying to think through what stakeholder theory and business ethics have to say to each other, the link, we argue, is value creation. So value does get created through purposeful stakeholder relationships. That's the only way that value gets generated in the first place. But then the question is, how is value distributed among the stakeholders who participated in its creation? And this is really where the ethical issues lie in the context of stakeholder theory and thinking about stakeholder capitalism. Because this conference is at least in person, in Brussels, one of my favorite places in Brussels is the Magritte Museum, and the Son of Man is my favorite picture. And there's this wonderful quote in which Magritte describes the picture. Everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden by what we see. There is an interest in that which is hidden, in which the visible does not show us. So I've been playing with this notion of invisibility in my head for a number of years. When I was the conference chair of the ABIS conference in Hong Kong, indeed, I made the theme of the conference making the invisible visible in business and society research. And the reason why invisibility is so important is that it really relates to managerial cognition. If you don't see something, you can't really act on it. So think of all the things that we'll talk to students, for example, about related to moral imagination. Your moral imagination is in large part driven by what you see and, of course, what you don't see. And so our contention is that for stakeholder capitalism to be truly effective as an alternative model of capitalism, and of course, tomorrow there's a lot of discussion about what stakeholder capitalism is, how it looks, how it's different. We submit that it really needs to make the invisible visible to managers, ultimately in ways that change their behaviors and decision-making processes. So for stakeholder capitalism to be different, I think it requires that managers see differently and then behave and act differently. Now, linking this to the why of stakeholder invisibility, in the paper, we'll talk about some critical elements that predict whether a stakeholder is visible or invisible. Many of us work with Tom Jones' model of moral intensity, the whole notion being that the greater the moral intensity, the greater the recognition that an ethical issue exists, which then impels managers to act. And one of the critical elements of moral intensity is proximity. So proximity has both a physical dimension, how close are you in physical space, but also a social dimension. So how far are you away in social space? Think about the managers, for example, making decisions in global value chains. They're far away in physical space, but they're also far away in social space. They're literally occupying a different world than the people who are in supply or value chains. The lack of stakeholder ability to exercise voice is also fundamental. If you can't exercise voice, you're not going to be heard. And if you're not going to be heard, or you don't have the potential to be heard, you're going to be invisible to managers. But then the third element is the perceptions of managers that a stakeholder is insignificant or ancillary to value creation. So in some sense, managers pay attention to the stakeholders that have the greatest nexus in their perception to value creation. So obviously, employees, for example, that control really critical forms of knowledge are going to be taken more seriously. So this notion of invisibility, I think, is really important. And I just want to surface the notion that invisibility can be understood both literally and functionally. So sometimes the problem is that a stakeholder literally isn't seen, but other times it's the case that there's a kind of functional invisibility, that the manager is aware, but in some sense, the stakeholder is almost in the manager's peripheral vision when it comes to decision-making. And then we link the notion of stakeholder invisibility to rights, which is due to my primary field of research these days. So going back to Mitchell, Agel, and Wood, we know that there's a strong relationship between stakeholder power and the likelihood that a stakeholder's claims will be heard by a business. The greater the power, the greater the stakeholder salience, the more likely it is that the stakeholder is going to be taken seriously. Now, there is an interesting relationship between stakeholder power and human rights. So sometimes stakeholders lack power because their rights are being violated. Think, for example, about the people that live next to mining operations. They're often physically relocated by government so that the mining companies can come in and extract the resources. So the stakeholders have rights, but those rights are being violated. They're literally being inhibited by the national government, and that then has an effect on their power. We also observe, following a long line of research in business and human rights, that stakeholders who lack power are often located in places in which you have lots of violations of human rights. We also link this to the notion of proximity. So the places where violations of human rights are rife or epidemic tend to be very far away in physical and social space from managers. And it's this notion of occupying different worlds then affecting managerial cognition in managerial decision-making. And many of the folks in the room will be familiar with the business and human rights literature. And so the whole notion is we apply human rights ideas and human rights responsibilities to businesses as non-state actors. So here are various examples of human rights, many of which are applicable to business in their spheres of influence. And as is noted in the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, while states have a primary responsibility to protect human rights, that's why they exist after all, businesses have an important responsibility to respect human rights, and both states and corporations have obligations to ensure that victims have access to effective remedy. So right now, the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights is happening in Geneva. That's really probing the contours of business responsibility for human rights. And then to add to that, an area of research that really ties together notions of proximity and power and stakeholder voice are focusing on global supply chains. So global supply chains, of course, are far-flung. The managers who make decisions about where to use suppliers are far away in physical and social space from the workers whose rights are being violated. And here are various reports that really reflect on this important issue. So what we argue in the full paper is that this emerging field of business and human rights can really play a role in surfacing, making more salient the contributions of invisible stakeholders to managers. And so I've given a couple of examples: workers in global supply chains, communities that live next to mining operations. And we argue that making the invisible visible has implications for both managerial decision-making and business strategy. To the extent, for example, that business strategies are highly likely to lead to violations of human rights, we argue that those ought to be changed, that businesses ought to pursue different strategies. But surfacing the importance of invisible stakeholders really is important, because we argue that this is an incredibly important element of cognition. So if you recognize that stakeholders exist, even if they're far away from you in physical and social space, that affects how you think, and in turn should affect business policies. And so to sum up, because I'm almost at time, in the paper, we seek to analyze stakeholder invisibility as read through the prism of human rights. And so we think this is the distinctive contribution that we're making in the paper. And we do this to advance a conceptualization of stakeholder capitalism, in which managers make visible the stakeholder contributions that are invisible, either literally or in practical terms. And in so doing, we believe that this brings human rights into the conversation about value creation and ultimately stakeholder capitalism. And I will stop here and stop my share. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Buren, for the presentation. It has been great. We have 4 minutes for questions. So is there any hand, anybody? Just to meet yourself.
If I may.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mr. Van Buren, for that very important presentation. I was just wondering, why did you decide to focus on moral intensity in comparison to perhaps other ways of prioritization, say salience or legitimacy?
The reason why we chose moral intensity was exactly because one of the elements of Jones's model of moral intensity is proximity. And with my students, for example, I spend a lot of time talking about proximity. So I'll talk, for example, about the Milgram studies. And for me, one of the lessons of the Milgram studies is you don't have to be very, very far away in physical space to be, in practical terms, invisible to somebody who's making a decision. So of course, the setup of the Milgram experiments, somebody's on the opposite side of the wall. The vast majority of people shocked or would have shocked people to death. And so what I do with my students is I take them through the model of moral intensity and I say, well, let's look at the Milgram experiments. Very small distance in physical space, and yet people were willing to shock all the way to the death. Now let's look at global supply chains, where you have people that are incredibly far away. And so the reason why we use moral intensity, it's less about the full model of moral intensity and more about the really important element of proximity that we think plays a big role in thinking about managerial decision-making that we then link to human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Buren. It is 17:44, so it's pretty much, yeah, you should, Karina, start by 45. So maybe it's better to just move to the next presentation. Mrs. Karina Orkis from the Monarchy Business School of Switzerland. Your talk is about prioritizing your employees under stakeholder capitalism.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair,
Thanks.
and thank you for the introduction. Kindly note that I will not be using PowerPoint at this stage, unlike my colleagues. I would like to say congratulations to all my colleagues for their contribution to this larger topic of great importance. Now, in the first part of the discussion on stakeholder capitalism, we touched upon the future generations. So I will be the one addressing this enormous issue in more depth. The systemic subservience for the future generations of employees has led to general employee disengagement, which is a source of trouble for many worldwide businesses, with 85% of global employees being actively disengaged at work. Now, as we all know, disengagement equates to approximately 7 trillion in lost productivity and an overall fragmented employee welfare. This issue is especially relevant in the existing work environment, in which managers need to ensure the engagement of Generation Z or Gen Z employees. These employees represent a quarter of the workforce. Gen Z, which includes individuals born after 1996, is the least engaged generational group with their work, faces the highest numbers of work-related mental health struggles, and it is most prone to job switching, with 77% intending to change jobs in the following year. For all interested in employee engagement, it may be helpful at first to understand the typical characteristics of the 4 generations that comprise today's multi-generational workforce. First, we have boomers, born between 1946 and 1964. These workers generally occupy senior positions, exhibit high company loyalty, and a strong work ethic. They believe that hard work leads to success. Now, boomers, they are principally motivated by money and the desire to hold on to their hierarchical positions. Then we have Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980. They have a strong work ethic, but less company loyalty. They avoid long-term commitment. Gen Y, also known as millennials, born between 1981 and 1996. These employees are not loyal to companies. They view jobs as occupations, not as vocations. And finally, Gen Z, born after 1996. These tech-savvy individuals tend to expect rapid rewards. They resist adaptation to the workplace hierarchies and resent the power differences between themselves and more tenured employees. Now, according to Schwab and Van Ham, all legitimate stakeholders under stakeholder capitalism should receive a seat at the table. Institutional and societal actors, however, have failed to provide a unified agenda for the development of the future generations of employees. The predominant literature on stakeholder capitalism, of course, discusses the future of the next generations in a very broad sense. However, existing literature does not sufficiently address the next generations of employees. There is an insignificant amount of research on the dynamics of Gen Z that lead to their lack of preparedness for their organizational roles. So having recognized this research gap and managerial problem, the findings and framework that I will share with you are based on original primary research. The research uncovers the employee behaviors of Gen Z and their managers, and uniquely incorporates the lower and higher levels of analysis. The field study method, or qualitative phenomenological, was combined with the lived experience of Gen Z employees working with their older managers. The non-random research sample consisted of 75 participants. This total included 45 managers belonging to the Boomer, Gen Z, and Gen Y groups. Along with 30 Gen Z employees, interviews were conducted in a total of 42 companies. Findings illustrate that the youngest generational group of employees is not treated as a priority in companies. Companies such as Deloitte and Amazon voiced their doubt pertaining to their ability to effectively meet the needs of young employees. Yet their managers receive no senior level support. Increased pressures on organizations to respond to different stakeholder groups generated the extensive discourse on stakeholder prioritization. Several stakeholder classifications typologies emerged, as my colleague before me mentioned: legitimacy, salience, relationship level, power, centrality, or morality. And under all of them, the future generations of employees should have been prioritized. Considering the premise of stakeholder theory to advance ethical, managerial, and stakeholder action, it is argued that the next generation of employees represent primary stakeholders that should be prioritized under stakeholder capitalism. And companies, some of them, may be tempted to see these as a problem for, say, their HR departments to address, when in fact, business leaders, executives, business schools, and governments must now provide the larger part of the solution. The societal contract, the primordial one between generations, dictates that each generation must prepare the one that follows, said seminal author Karl Mannheim. In the field of commerce, businesses can fulfill that obligation by better preparing managers and executives to lead the future generations of promising professionals. 5 mechanisms can help companies to do so. First, multi-generation diversity training for managers and employees. Managers need to learn how to lead the multi-generational workforce. Employees need to learn how to work with each other. Diversity training should include sections on the different characteristics, needs, and communication styles of the generations. Creating mixed generation teams. Managers should create teams formed of multiple generations and assign roles based on generational capabilities. For instance, in mixed generation teams, boomers are well suited for process-oriented assignments, and Gen Zers can contribute technological skills. Gen X employees speak the language of both boomers and Gen Z, and they often make ideal project leaders. Onboarding should respond to the unique needs of Gen Z employees. Complex onboarding processes are detrimental to company performance because Gen Z employees have a high turnover rate and very short employee life cycle. Onboarding modifications include rapid integration, gamified onboarding through information systems, and access to on-demand information. Organizational modification for experienced employees should include reframing knowledge sharing versus knowledge acquisition as a benchmark for retention. Collaboration of business schools, businesses, and governments to create their own partnership in communities for the better preparedness of young employees. At the highest level, the development of a common agenda that communicates common needs and values for the next generation of employees would best aid all actors involved in leading change for the future. CSR reports should include multi-generational diversity goals and metrics for both corporations, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises. These could include indicators of partnerships with business schools, conferences for managers, or in-company multi-generational diversity training. Reporting may also include success stories on turning intergenerational conflict into collaboration and bring case studies on the performance of mixed generation teams. Yearly progress should, of course, be measured against previous goals. So overall, the Great Resignation, Gen Z employee disengagement, and high personnel turnover are indicators that traditional organizational practices are not up to the challenges of the day. They are indicative of the mismanagement because of the incorrect assessment of the importance of the future generations of employees. Governments and business schools may be tempted to let companies solve personnel issues on their own, but in fact, all of us are part of the problem and need to be part of the solution to prepare the young generation of employees for effective workplace participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. That was a great presentation. So is there any questions, any raised hands among the participants? Well, because we still have time until 6 o'clock, and then we will go to the main meeting for the conclusions for the whole event. So, Karina, I have a question about the, you talk about the experience of different generations in the economic setting, But what is the causality of the fact that different generations experience different visions? Because up to a certain extent, one also can say that there are certain generalizations that the experiences from rich young people are certainly not the same than for young people, and that it's not generation the only driver for this situation or these problematics that you defined before, but other issues like lack of inequality, gender issues, also geographical issues may influence in that as well. I was wondering what was the role and why did you decide to choose on the generational aspect when talking about inequality and the problematization of the economy?
Well, thank you for this question. It is a very good one. What we're seeing now across all media and across the voices of practicing managers is they're saying in a unified voice, we don't know what to do with the young generations of employees. And we've seen this before, categorized and classified throughout the news as the millennial problems. And this has been 5 years ago, and now we're seeing the Gen Z problem. So I'm using generational thinking and I'm studying them as cohorts. Whereas, of course, you could also study it in different geographies, you could do a gender split, but those would be going into more depth to see if there are any variances on that. But to go back to one of your to the first part of your question, you're asking what accounts for these differences? And this was a question I've struggled with because the literature was saying we have differences in preferences. Of course, people at different ages have different preferences. It accounts for the maturation stages and for the different experiences that they've been having. So I've looked at the dynamics in the workforce, and what I've been seeing is that the problem is a power problem, much like my colleagues were highlighting. It always comes down to a power problem. The young employees are entering the workforce sometimes with some unrealistic expectations, and then there they face boomers or Gen X or older managers who want to maintain their positions of power, so they're less inclined to teaching the young generation. I hope this answers your question succinctly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karina. Is there any raised hands? Also, feel free if you don't want to speak or your mic doesn't work to just type your question in the comments. So one of the things that you mentioned, Karina, I'll just keep making questions because while other people think on, if you look at the demographic pyramids in the West that are no longer pyramids, but more like columns, we see a big amount of baby boomers. That's why they are called baby boomers, because they make a boom in the demographic pyramid, who are on the verge to retire. So this situation of lack of power may have been caused as well because of the own structure of the demographic pyramid, but also as this generation will retire soon, these positions of power will be led to both millennials, Generation Z, but also to Zoomers or to Generation Z. So what are your expectations in the demographic transition in the coming 5-10 years in this sense?
What I've been looking at is indicating that boomers, unlike maybe generations before them, will try to seek employment for longer because they have some type of financial strain that the generations before them and the generations after them don't have. So boomers are the only generation that needs to both account for older parents and younger children. So they are in a much higher strain than the previous generation. So I think we can safely say boomers will still have a massive influence on the workplace in the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks. As I see no questions, and it's 59, so we may be kicked out very soon. And I don't want to make a question that lasts too long and then.
May I ask, have you taken in consideration also the culture, the context of those boomers and what, because different countries or different cultures, not different countries, will probably look at these problems differently, I suppose. And what are they willing or not willing, depending on their experiences, values, all of that.
Definitely, that's a very pertinent way to look at it. One way in which we consider generational studies is we look at the generational actuality and the events that took part in a place of the world that influenced those generations. And certainly boomers are one of the generations that were highly influenced by the different events that took part in the different places of the world. However, as we're moving towards Gen Z, we're seeing less dissimilarities in between Gen Zers cross-culturally because they're heavily influenced by technology, something that was less of an influence on boomers. But their interactions are somehow the same, the interactions between Gen Z and boomers. Thank you.
Since there are no questions, when you define boomers and different generations, in which context you define those? Because, for instance, I'm thinking out of my head, baby boomers in Spain are considered to be a decade older because Spain didn't participate in World War II, but also because of Francoism. So these demographic dynamics took a decade more than the rest of Europe to define. And also in the global South, there's no such thing as baby boom as we know it in the global North. So where did you, from what context did you took these definitions and your observations?
Yes, you are correct. As I've said, it depends, especially for the boomers, or what we say boomers when we speak in a US-centric terminology. It depends on the events that took part in specific parts of the world. So we have various ways when studying generations to do this, but the way we usually do it when studying business and the workplace, we usually take the US-centric terminology and apply it. Of course, if you go to a specific country, you would apply the terminology that is applicable to that country. But when we speak at the macro level in generational studies, we tend to take those from the US, and usually the ones by Pew Research Center. Now, it is also true that when we define any type of generation, it is not clear cut. We have numerous authors, numerous sources. The years change from year to year. When I started studying Gen Z, we were considering them from 1994, then it became 1995, it turned into 1996, even 1997, and I presume we're not yet done defining this generation. So it always moves, almost like we're now defining stakeholder capitalism and stakeholder themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. Just as a reminder, we set in the comments a poll, so you can give us your feedback on the colloquium and the whole event. So please feel free to click on it. And because we are not being kicked out yet, and I want to make a small question. Are you, Karina, an optimistic or a pessimist when we're looking at the future?
I try to be a realist in all my endeavors. So I realize that there are power struggles in terms of the generations coming together in businesses, but I also realize that what we're seeing now with this immense turnover and with manager burnout, there will be changes that need to be made because we can no longer continue as we've been doing. Changes will definitely be made pertaining to the young generations in the workforce. The extent of those changes is, of course, yet unknown.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the other rooms will be closing soon. So if there's any other short question. Yeah.
But I think we can come back to the main session if there aren't any other questions.
Yeah, if you don't have more questions, you can just click on the bottom right of your screen, the bottom leave the room. So you'll be sent to the the main room. But I think there are some groups that are still. At first, I was rushing this very much because it's like, no, we have like only 15 minutes per person. But now I see that the other rooms are, yeah, now breakout rooms will close in 55. Well, but thank you very much to the three speakers, because it was very interesting and very inspiring to hear the three of you. So thanks and congratulations for your I haven't read your papers personally. I couldn't have the time, but it was very inspiring to hear you and your presentations.